Welcome back to our special coverage. I'm joined now by Neil Katyal, who wrote the special counsel rules that governed Mueller and has been writing about this for some time, including something he noted in the New York Times. If indictment's off the table, impeachment must be on it. If impeachment's off the table because of nefarious congressional activity, then indictment must be on it. That is some context for what we're seeing, including this defense from the Trump team, the Trump organization, now suing the House to try to prevent a subpoena of Donald Trump's confidential financial records. Joining me now as part of our opening argument series is former Solicitor General Neil Katyal. Good evening.
Good evening, Ari.
What do you think is most important as the country is still learning about what's in this report and trying to understand whether Congress has a role to play, or as Mitch McConnell said today, everyone should just move on?
Well, I think if folks were just listening to David Kelly, who's a fabulous lawyer, they would be like, why would we think about impeachment? Because Mr. Kelly said, you know, that Mueller's prosecutor's gut was that there wasn't obstruction evidence that was there, that there was too many hurdles, and so on. But actually, Mueller said none of that. And I think the most important thing for all Americans to understand is what Mueller actually said. And on the first 2 pages of his report, where he has 2 rules, rule number 1, I, Mueller, can't indict a sitting president, and I won't tar and feather a sitting president because I can't indict him and he won't have an opportunity to defend himself. And what that means, he says, is that even if the president is guilty as sin, I'm not going to tell you. It's not going to be in the report. That's rule 1. Number 2 is if the evidence shows that Trump did nothing wrong, I'll exonerate him, I'll clear him. And Mueller does not do that. So when we think about what are the next steps, we have to understand the Mueller report in its context. And as you just said so helpfully for the last few minutes, the report actually, when you look at the evidence on obstruction, is devastating. I mean, Mueller points to example after example in which all the elements of obstruction of justice are met. Criminal intent, an obstructive act, and a nexus to a proceeding. So when you add all that together, I think I'm where the Congresswoman was just a few minutes ago with you, Ari, which is Trump is going to have a day with destiny. There isn't a way to avoid it. Congress is going to have to do something. Yes, they're going to hand-wring over the politics of the thing and so on, and maybe a lot of them don't want to do it. They'd rather talk about health care and other things, but it's part of their constitutional duty.
What does it tell you that people are openly invoking politics? I mean, it was, as I just noted, it was Democrats and others, many others, who criticized Republicans who were quiet in the face of Charlottesville or other things Donald Trump did that were obviously more important than politics of the day. Should that standard apply to the constitutional obligations here?
Absolutely not. And particularly so because Mueller himself has said, I can't indict a sitting president, and Barr has taken that and carried it to its logical conclusion. So now Congress is the ballgame. And every scholar who says a sitting president can't be indicted couples that with the view that the way to remedy a president who's breaking the law is to seek their impeachment. Otherwise, to use the antiquated term by Jeff Sessions, no one is above the law. And that's, of course, not Sessions' term. That goes all the way back to 1610 in Dr. Bonham's case in England.
I thought it was Jeff Sessions' original. I didn't know he was remixing older stuff. Let me also play for you, Neil, Rudy Giuliani, who seems to find a way to muddy or complicate what might have been an easier set of weekend interviews. Take a look.
It doesn't matter whether there was an underlying crime. It's still obstruction.
Well, when did Mueller become God? There's nothing wrong with taking information from Russians.
There's nothing wrong with taking information.
Depends on where it came from.
Don McGahn saved him. Why is the president angry?
Don McGahn didn't save him.
Don McGahn didn't carry out an obstruction
That wasn't
and
an obstruction.
saved him.
He could have fired
Mueller.
He had a perfect right to fire Mueller.
Neil?
OMG, I don't even know where to begin, Ari. I mean, you know, let me just take there's nothing wrong with getting information from the Russians. The Russians are our most sophisticated adversary. Trump has been denying that they interfered in the election time and again to the, you know, consternation of the intelligence community. The idea that there's nothing wrong, I never thought in my lifetime, Ari, I would hear a president of the United States top lawyer saying that. It's astounding to me, and yet further reason why the Congresswoman's right. Congress has to take a deep look at this and ask, what the heck is going on? Why is there so much weirdness in this administration about Russia?
Yeah, it's a lot of important questions. We've been relying on your expertise a lot, and luckily we get to come back to you soon. So Neil Katyal, as part of our opening argument series, thank you as always for joining us on The Beat, sir.
Thank you.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.